Okay. Firstly, I'd like to thank Hero and the organising committee for inviting me to come and speak at this session this morning. I hope you're enjoying the conference. It's been very well organised, and our thanks go to the organising committee in particular. My talk is a little bit broader than the first two talks this morning. I'm going to be talking generally about practice, instruction, and skill acquisition in football. More specifically, I aim to do three things. Firstly, what I'll do is outline the importance of practice in regard to the development of elite players. We all know that practice is important, but sometimes we can be quite surprised when we look at the sheer quantity of practice hours that elite performers accumulate over their career span within the sport. It's not just the amount of practice that is important, of course, but also the quality of practice. So I'll secondly talk about some of the key practice variables or types of practice activities that have been seen to be important in differentiating players who progress to professional level within sport and those who don't. And then finally, I'll talk about some of the practical implications as far as coaching sessions and developing more effective practice and training opportunities for players to develop the skills that are needed at the elite level. Let me start off first and foremost, therefore, by looking at the practice history profiles of elite players. The earliest data in team sport was actually gathered by a colleague at the University of Leuven in Belgium, Werner Helsen. So what he did, he used questionnaires, semi-structured interviews, and training logs to begin to look at the practice history profiles of three groups of soccer players in Belgium. So they were international, national, and provincial players. All were professional players. So what we have on the left-hand side here is the total accumulated practice hours, both in terms of years across the career and in regard to chronological age. Clearly what you can see here is that the international players accumulate considerably more practice than their national and provincial counterparts. The important issue is that by the age of 23, 18 years into career, the international players have accumulated almost 10,000 hours of practice within the particular sport. I'll also draw your attention here, if you look at, let's say, the age of 16, you see that the elite level players in Belgium here have accumulated around 5,000 hours of practice. I'll come on to that a little bit later, but remember this data was gathered in the mid-1990s. There were also attempts to begin to look at the microstructure of practice. The smaller graphs on the right-hand side here talk about the amount of hours accumulated in individual practice. The international players accumulated more hours in individual practice early on in their development and more hours in team practice later on in their development. This is some more recent data that we gathered around 2005, so 10 years on, using groups of Premier League academy players in England, which are the elite players. These are from 3 clubs in the northwest of England. And sub-elite players were good quality players who represented their local schools. So what you can see here is that by the age of 16, the Premier League academy players have accumulated 7,000 hours of practice. So maybe this illustrates, in essence, the advent of the Premier League academies in 1997 and the fact that the players have more systematic access to coaches, which has, in essence, increased their number of practice hours. If you put it into context, if you have a 6-year-old boy in England and you would like them to become a professional player, what does it take? Well, in essence, they have to be involved in the sport for 9 to 10 years. Roughly works out at around 850 hours of practice per year, 18 hours of practice per week, roughly split into 9 hours of that in coach-led practice and about 9 hours of it in non-coach-led practice. So around 7,500 hours of practice by the age of 16. Huge commitment, huge investment in the sport. What we don't have, I'm afraid, is comparable data across any of the other codes of football. I'm unaware of, we have a small amount of data from Gaelic football, which suggests that the hours are high, but nowhere near as high as they are in soccer. But unfortunately, this kind of approach and method has not been used across any of the other codes of football. Interestingly, when we also asked the players to rate the factors that they thought most important in relation to them to becoming skilled players, the elite group put practice at the top. In silver medal position was motivation, the desire to win, the attitude, the dedication, and the determination. And enjoyment was third on the list of things that they considered to be important in becoming a professional player. In contrast, the sub-elite players attributed a lot of their ability to progress to skill, albeit practice was second and teamwork was third. So there's a real realization here that engagement in practice on behalf of the academy players is crucial in order to progress within the sport. What is important here, of course, is that it's not the mere accumulation of experience that is important. Okay, what is important is the number of hours that are actually accumulated in what's called deliberate practice activity. Deliberate practice activity is specific training activity where feedback is given, where there is opportunity to engage in trial and error learning and to refine the movement and to progress. So typically deliberate practice requires athletes to have high concentration, high motivation, to be very mentally and physically engaged in the task. The key issue is that this is a graph from Anders Ericsson, and one of the key arguments that he would say is this is a typical graph of performance against experience. And most of us, in terms of everyday skills, goes through 3 stages of development: cognitive, associative, and then into the autonomous stage. What he says is that those at the elite level actually end up in a very automatic phase where they don't spend a lot of time thinking about the activity, whereas in contrast, true experts strive to avoid the onset of expertise. So they actually are continually engaged in deliberate practice activity in an effort to improve and refine performance on the task. Okay, so roughly around 10,000 hours of practice are needed to become an elite soccer player. As I said at the start, it's not just the quantity, however, it's also the quality. So most recently what we've begun to do is to look at the microstructure of practice, if you like, the fine detail of the practice in relation to the activities in which these players are engaging. In one study that we completed a few years ago, what we did is we identified 3 groups of players from 3 Premier League academies. So what we had is 2 groups of Premier League academies, players rather. These players joined the academies at 6. They progressed through the academy to the age of 16. Some of them were released by the club, which is our released group here in red, and some of them were offered a 3-year professional contract. Okay, so they still became professionals at the club. And our recreational control group here is a group of school-based players, again in the northwest of England. And what we have here is the proportion of hours spent in coach-led individual and team practice over the last 4 years prior to the decision to retain or release. So this would be age 12, 13, 13, 14, 14, 15, 15, 16, you're in or you're out. And these are hours per week in individual practice and team practice. Not surprisingly there, you see there are no differences between the players who progress to professional status and those who don't. And that clearly because they're systematically engaged in the training program at the academy players spend considerably more hours in coach-led activity compared to their recreational counterparts. The most interesting data came in this graph. So this was the proportion of hours spent in non-coach-led practice activity outside of the academy environment. So here again we've got the hours per week across the last 4 years prior to the decision to retain or release. The players who eventually become professional spend around 9 hours per week in this type of activity. So this in essence would be street football, playing with their friends, kicking a ball against a wall, anything that did not occur formally within the academy environment. In contrast, there apparently equally skilled players who were also in the academy only spent around 3 hours per week in this type of time. Most recently, we've extended this study. We've now got 5 Premier League clubs involved, and our sample is getting bigger. As the clubs release the players, they go into our release sample, and obviously as they're offered professional contracts, they go into our professional group. This is the same data from the 5 Premier League academies for the years 6 to 12 now. And a very similar trend emerges. So what you can see here is that the players who eventually become professional at the age of 16 have accumulated almost 3 times the amount of hours in street football related activity than the players who progress through the academy and are not offered a professional contract. So it seems that this engagement in non-coach led activity is obviously important in relation to the development players. I guess the interesting question is, do the professional players progress because they just spend more time in practice, the accumulation of coach-led and non-coach-led activity, or is it something about the nature of this play-related activity that is important, in the sense perhaps that it gives the opportunity for players to engage technical and decision-making skills in an integrated and dynamic environment. It's very much a discovery-led environment where players have to adapt and learn to solve those particular problems. You could spin the question round, of course, and I'll try and answer this issue in a minute with some data of asking the question, is there evidence of overcoaching within the formal academy environment? Interestingly, we've now got some data from elite players in Brazil. So these are 50 players from one of the professional clubs in Brazil. So what we have here is the hours per year across different age groups spent in 3 different types of practice activities. There's match play or competition, practice, which is coach-led, and play, which is non-coach-led. And what you can see here is that this group of elite Brazilian players spend a lot of time in play-related activity very on in their development. On top of this, by the way, you could add an average of 200 hours per year in futsal. Okay, futsal is a variant of soccer, but it's not included in these particular practice hours. So 200 hours a year is roughly about 4 hours per week. So you can add another 4 hours onto the 4 hours that they're also doing in football. So they're engaging around 9 hours per week again in this play-related environment without direct access to coaching. Later on in practice, as you can see, more coach-led practice becomes quite prevalent. We also know, interesting, in one study, what we've done is we've taken players from 3 Premier League academies, we've tested them on a battery of film-based skills tests designed to measure their anticipation and decision-making skill. And what we've done is we've grouped them into players who are high-performing on these tests as far as their game intelligence skill is concerned, not so well-performing, and we've also had a sub-elite group of players. And what we find here again is that the groups within the academy who demonstrate exceptionally good anticipation and decision-making skills, i.e. game intelligence skills, also accumulate significantly more hours in play-related activity across their career span. So it seems that this non-coach-led practice activity is influential in conjunction with coach-led practice activity in terms of deciding whether you become a professional and in terms of deciding whether you develop good decision-making skills or not.